If the resurrection is not true, then Christianity hinges on that resurrection. If it's not true, then what are we doing here? It's a beautiful day. Let's go to a park. Let's go fly a kite. But instead, we can rest assured that the resurrection is indeed a true event. Actual event that took place in history. Let me just give you what's called the minimal facts. There's all sorts of things that can be said historically about this event, but here are a few things that all scholars, virtually all scholars, like over 75%, some of these 90%, all scholars are going to agree on, whether they are Christian or atheist or Buddhist or Jewish or whatever. They're going to look at these historical things and say, yes, these are facts. First, that Jesus did indeed die. There was a man, Jesus, he was crucified, that he was buried in a tomb, that tomb was found empty 3 days later, that his disciples sincerely claimed, they believed that they saw Jesus raised from the dead, and that there was a change in these disciples because of that experience where they went from fearful hiding to boldly proclaiming, and Christianity was launched around the world. Those are historical facts. Now, some people might say, yeah, but I don't know that necessarily means he was resurrected. But let me set and let you know that these aren't made up. Some people say, well, the Bible, that's just a religious book, that's just legend. No. Historical documents. The only reason not to accept this is a worldview bias that says, I don't want to accept the Bible because you don't like what it says, not because it's not historically reliable. Dr. Bart Ehrman, he's a textual critic. We've talked about him before. He is agnostic or atheist, depending on, I guess the day of the week, he flip-flops there. But he is no fan of Christianity. He's written several books against the Bible, but even he says that one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Historian who's an expert in Jewish burial practices, Jody Magnus, she says that the gospel accounts describing Jesus' removal from the cross and burial accord well with archaeological evidence and with the Jewish law. It bears out that they have no reason to think this did not actually happen. D.H. Van Dalen says that it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Again, Bart Ehrman, no friend of Christianity, says, we can say with complete certainty that some of his disciples at some later time insisted that he soon appeared to them, convincing them that he had been raised from the dead. Paula Fredrickson, another historian and not a Christian either, says that the disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ is part of historical bedrock, facts known past doubting. So we have established as historical fact in the record, accepted by people across all faiths and beliefs, that there was Jesus, that he was killed on the cross by Pontius Pilate, that he was put in a tomb, the tomb was found empty, his disciples then claimed to have seen him risen, and then the change that took place with the founding of the church. So what do we do with these facts? Some people say, well, it can't be resurrection. That's just impossible. Because people, once they're dead, they stay dead. But that's not a historical claim. That's their view. That's their belief that they're putting onto the facts. When you kind of look over the explanations that have been offered throughout history to explain this event, they all fall short. It's resurrection that stands above the rest. For instance, some people say, well, they just hallucinated. In their grief, that they had this, they thought it was Jesus, but they just wanted so bad, they're so distraught over him now being gone that it was a hallucination. The only problem with that is you have multiple people having separate hallucinations that all line up together. And then you have several instances where you have groups of people who would have had to share a hallucination. Hallucinations are individual. The fact that all of these corroborate and line up with each other, the idea of it being hallucination does not stand. Some people say, well, this body was stolen. Well, who stole it? Was it the disciples? Some people say the disciples stole it so they can then perpetuate the sham that he had risen from the dead. The only problem is it's a historical fact that they really believed. And if they would have known it was false, that doesn't line up with the facts. It wouldn't have been the enemies. From the very earliest days of Christianity, the opponents of Christianity tried to answer this question of where's the body? If your enemies are admitting the body's gone, I think that's pretty good evidence that the tomb was empty. Some people say swoon. You'll hear this one on, I don't think anyone really seriously considers this, but you'll find it on Discovery Channel and History Channel and whatnot. He didn't actually die, is the claim. That he was just so succumbed to his wounds that he passed out, and they thought he was dead, but then later he recovered. The only problem with that is you don't really recover from what happened to him, especially the part where they stab him in the side with a spear. Not to mention that the appearances aren't something that were years later. It was the next day. Like the very next day, he's walking down the road to Emmaus, talking with some disciples after being crucified. I don't think that bears out. Some people say it was a conspiracy. The disciples, they kind of put this together and it's, don't tell anybody, we're going to make this up, and it was a conspiracy. The only problem is conspiracies do not function well if you have large numbers of people, high external pressure, and the ability of people to just prove you wrong. And in this case, we have a great number of people that would have had to have been involved in the conspiracy. The more people you add, or the more links in the chain that could be a weak link. And you have a highly stressful situation where Christians are being persecuted and jailed and beaten and even killed in some instances. And it's in a location where those who would have been against it would have easily been able to disprove it. Some people say, well, it's just a legend. That's just made up. But in order to do that, they have to reject the facts of history. These historical facts that have been established by all sorts of historians, not just Christian ones. The only explanation that fits all of the evidence is the resurrection, that Christ did indeed raise from the dead on the third day. The only obstacle that stands in the way of accepting that explanation, which fits all the evidence, is an ideological one, a belief one that says, I don't want to accept that. No, resurrections are off the table. Okay, but that's not a historical evidential claim. That's a personal bias claim. And so we have from the historical evidence, and these are just 5 things I mentioned. There's plenty more, but these are some of the best attested ones. That the only thing that really holds it all up and says, okay, this makes perfect sense of all the evidence is indeed the resurrection.